I bet you didn't know that Andrew Jackson had a poor education. Even though Andrew Jackson had a poor education, he worked hard to become a lawyer and the 7th President of the United States. Even though he was a hard worker, President Andrew Jackson was not very interesting. In fact, Andrew Jackson was the most boring president to serve our country. Andrew Jackson had a sad childhood. He was born on March 5, 1767, in a log cabin in Waxhaw, South Carolina. Andrew Jackson's family was poor, and he had to live with his mom's sister in Crawford. He had red hair, so he had a really bad temper. Andrew Jackson had gotten cut by an officer on his hand and scalp when he was a prisoner of militia and had caught smallpox. Then he recovered from smallpox, thankfully. Unfortunately, Andrew Jackson had a lot of rough hobbies. Andrew Jackson loved wrestling, so he wrestled with his brothers all the time. He would go outside and race his brothers all day long until they got really tired and had to relax. Andrew would always play pranks, and his mom wasn't really happy about that, though. The thing that was his favorite was teasing his brothers by making them do stupid things all the time. Andrew Jackson lost his family at an early age. His dad, Andrew Jackson, had passed away before he was born. He was named in honor of his dad, since he had died before he was born. His mother, Elizabeth Jackson, had traveled to Charleston, South Carolina after the militia and died after her arrival from cholera. One of his brothers was Hugh. Hugh had died of heat stroke. And Robert, his other brother, died 2 days after getting home from prison. In addition, Andrew Jackson still went to school. He had found work making saddles and gear for horses, only at the age of 14. He had started school when he was 6 and learned Latin and Greek. He was smart, even though he received a poor education. He had returned to school after his mother died and finished his education. Then he went to study law in Salisbury, North Carolina. Even though he had a poor education, he still had really good jobs. Andrew Jackson was licensed on September 26, 1787, to be an attorney. He was offered a job as a public prosecutor after he had a hard time finding clients for the District of Carolina. He went after debtors and lawbreakers and helped draw up deeds, wills, and business contracts. Then he served as a delegate for the Tennessee Constitutional Convention, and he was the first U.S. congressman from Tennessee. After that, he was elected for U.S. Senate, but resigned to become judge for Tennessee Superior Court. Then he became the governor of Tennessee and U.S. Senate from Tennessee. Unfortunately, he didn't have children, but he did adopt one. Andrew Jackson married his wife, Rachel Robards, in 1791, but they had to remarry in 1794. They then adopted a child, so when Andrew Jackson was gone, the child would keep Rachel company. The child they adopted was Andrew Jackson Jr., after Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had a rough road to the White House. When Andrew Jackson first ran, his running mate was John C. Calhoun. He was against Adams, Clay, and Crawford. Jackson was also a Democrat. Sadly, he lost against John Quincy Adams. Fortunately, the second time he ran, it proved to be different. Andrew Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams, and his running mate was Martin Van Buren. Jackson had won with 690,000 electoral votes, and Adams lost with 510,000 electoral votes. Andrew Jackson had a boring presidency, accomplishing a few things. Andrew Jackson's inauguration was on March 4th, 1829, while he walked to the Capitol. When he did this, he made a speech as our 7th president. Andrew Jackson was 61 years old at the time. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act. He also accepted the cabinet resignations for Petticoat War in 1831. Although Andrew Jackson resigned, he left a mark on our nation as a boring leader. In 1832, he vetoed a bill recharging the Bank of the United States. Then in 1833, a compromise ended nullification crisis. Finally, in 1837, he recognized the government of the Republic of Texas. He then resigned, and Martin Van Buren was elected. He had resigned because he was a sick man suffering from a lot of ailments. Andrew Jackson resigned and later died from illness. Andrew Jackson resigned in 1836. He went to the Hermitage in Tennessee after he retired. He then died June 8, 1845, from being very sick. Andrew Jackson was then buried by his wife in the garden of the Hermitage at 78 years old. The most boring president was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson worked really hard to be a lawyer, even though Andrew Jackson had a poor education. Andrew Jackson was not very interesting, even as the 7th President of the United States. Andrew Jackson was a lonely teenager who grew up to be an uninteresting president.